Sabrina started at in 2012 in the economics department, and before that she did postdocs at Berkeley and at North Carolina State.
Yep.
And before that she got her PhD at University of Cambridge, and she studies the trade-offs between environmental protectionism and environmental development, and she's focused that lens on looking at forest conservation policies and how it affects private landowners and rural households in places like Brazil and China. So we're trying to get her interested in turning that attention to Montana and some of the problems that are in this region as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. So
hey, great. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks for this great turnout. I'm quite excited to be here, and I started talking to some of the people who are working on the same kinds of issues, but from a different angle, through a different lens. And it's already kind of making me think of things in new ways, which is quite nice. So the paper I'm going to talk about today looks at what is the price of avoiding deforestation. And so I think of price in this context in two ways. One is I'm going to talk a lot about policies to compensate landowners for not deforesting, and to some extent for reforesting. And so I'm interested in, well, what's the price you actually have to pay? What's the amount of compensation you have to pay? But that relates directly to the other thing that I'm in a way more interested in, which is if landowners are encouraged to avoid deforestation, then what's the price for them in terms of foregone benefits, in terms of foregone income that could have been earned if the land was cleared, in principle in terms of foregone income from timber harvests. So what are the costs actually borne by those who would have engaged in deforestation, but because of, in this case, mainly concerns about climate change, are being encouraged not to? So that's what I'm interested in. I want to give a little bit of background. The specific paper I'm going to present is, I'm standing here. The specific paper is about looking specifically at exactly what are the costs and how do we measure them and so on within a particular context. And it's a preliminary paper that I'm going to present some results from. However, that paper is part of a wider project that kind of gives you a sense of what I do more generally. So that wider project is called Living with Deforestation, and it's a large-scale interdisciplinary project. So this was something I was already doing before I came here, so that's why all of these activities that are going on through IOE were already exciting to me. It's a large-scale program in the Brazilian Amazon in a forest frontier region where deforestation is actively occurring. And what it's involved is following the same households from 1996 so far through to 2009, and we're trying to get funding to continue it. And for these households who have been engaged in deforestation, looking at what have the implications been for their incomes, for their accumulation of wealth, for their investment decisions, their migration decisions, and so on. So we're interested in what are the human welfare impacts, what are the development impacts of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And the reason that we're interested in that is understanding what are the trade-offs. So back to this idea of what if we want to reduce the amount of deforestation, what are we giving up if we do that? What are we giving up in terms of alleviation of poverty at the individual level? What are we giving up in terms of development at the regional level? So this idea of what are the costs of avoiding deforestation. So that's the kind of general background, and then this particular paper that I'll present results from looks at these questions in the context of what's called RED. And I've discovered that I've been working in one very tiny field for too long, so I'm like, oh yeah, RED, of course. Not everybody's familiar with the concept. The letters stand for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And RED is a policy framework that is increasingly becoming part of global efforts to mitigate climate change. So I'll talk a little bit more about what it is exactly, but the idea is that land cover change results in a large share of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Because of that, then reducing land cover change, particularly reducing deforestation, is an important part of efforts to mitigate climate change. Most of that deforestation is happening in developing countries, and so the REDD framework acknowledges that there are these trade-offs between reducing deforestation and development or poverty alleviation. And so it's looking for mechanisms through which members of rich countries can compensate members of poor countries, or within countries, mechanisms through which the individuals who are actually engaged in deforestation can be compensated for not deforesting. So the REDD mechanism is a big deal at the moment, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But basically, it does acknowledge these trade-offs. But what we don't know for implementing, what will be potentially a huge thing globally, is what are the local costs? How much compensation will be needed? So what this paper looks at is how large are the costs at the local level, and as part of working out how large the costs are, thinking about, well, how do we actually measure what the costs are? And also one of the things I'm particularly interested in, because if we're talking about regions of active deforestation, we're talking about frontier areas, processes of development are taking place, everything is changing, and so we can't just say what are the costs at one point in time, we need to know how those costs are likely to change over time. And so that's why it's interesting to look at a frontier region to see, as things are changing very rapidly in terms of land cover and in terms of the economic state of the region, then we need to see how things are changing, because that will inform us about avoiding deforestation in newer frontiers. Okay, so that's basically where I'm going. I'm going to talk about the idea of what's called payments for ecosystem services, because that is fundamental to what I'm considering and how that relates to this idea of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And then more specifically, what I'm trying to do is meet some of the requirements for information that would be needed to actually implement REDD policies. So I'll talk about the information that would be needed and what's been done so far on actually providing that information, and specifically actually calculating the costs. And then I'll talk a little bit about the data that I'm using. So it's from one particular region, as I say, on the active deforestation frontier, how we've collected the data, and then how I analyze the data. So I'll be using econometric methods, which are basically statistical methods for analyzing economic data. I'll have some fairly brief results from that, and what I really want to talk about are what are the implications of those results. And because this is all new work, I'm also interested in any feedback on what you think the implications of those results might be, whether you think that we're drawing the right conclusions from them. And with a little bit of time at the end, I've got some other work that is kind of future stuff relating to this that is even more interdisciplinary, so it might give ideas about how the kinds of things I do fit into the kinds of things that other people here do. Okay, so as I said, all of this is based in the idea of payments for ecosystem services. So who is familiar with the idea of payments for ecosystem services, just to have a sense? Okay, so about a third of the room, maybe. That's good. The idea of payments for ecosystem services is they're a policy mechanism aimed at protecting ecosystem services. And the way they do that is by compensating landowners for the ecosystem services that they provide, or the ecosystem services that their land management practices provide. So it's basically making a payment to a landowner because they are protecting forest land, because they're protecting watercourses, because they're using fewer agricultural inputs, anything that they do that actually benefits the environment. And so there are various policies that sort of fit into this idea, but 5 criteria have been set up to actually characterize what is a payments for ecosystem service mechanism. So the first is that it should be voluntary. So the idea is that private landowners are offered a contract to say, if you do these things, if you change your land management practices in these ways that will have environmental benefits, then you will receive this payment. And the landowner can say, yes, I will accept that contract, or no, I won't accept that contract. based on whether it's worth it for them or not. It should relate to some specific environmental service. It's not just if you do things in a generally kind of nicer way. It should relate to this is ultimately providing reductions in carbon emissions, or this is ultimately providing watershed protection. And the service should be bought by a buyer. Now, in many cases, that buyer is a national government. So it doesn't have to be a private buyer. It might be a conservation organization. It might be, in some cases, a private company. But it's somebody who benefits from the provision of those ecosystem services. Or in the case of a national government, they are the representative of all the individuals within the country who benefit from the provision of the ecosystem services. It should be bought from a provider. So I'm going to call that the landowner. It could be anybody who's making decisions about land management practices. And the important feature is that it should be conditional. So the payment isn't just a payment to be nice. It isn't just a payment. I'll talk about, there might be some poverty alleviation benefits to these programs, but it's not intended to be a kind of a welfare payment. It's intended to be, if you provide this service, I will offer this payment. So in theory, it should be conditional. In practice, it can be hard to say, okay, there'll be this policy, to actually monitor whether the ecosystem services are being provided. If they're not provided, but perhaps it was something that was out of control of the landowner, do you still give them the payment or not? So there are complications in terms of actually making it conditional, but in principle, it should be conditional. Okay, so that's the idea. And there is some kind of basic economics behind the concept. So payments for ecosystem services are what we as economists call economic instruments. Other people might just think they're policy mechanisms, but they're designed with on the basis that they actually change people's incentives, and they use economic incentives to result in the desired outcome. The idea is that ecosystem services are what we call externalities. So externality is just that they're benefits, they're outcomes of land management practices that don't accrue to the landowner or the land manager. So the landowner makes decisions about, for example, do I clear an extra hectare of forest land? They make that decision about clearing an extra hectare of forest land based on what could I earn from either timber harvests or agricultural production on that land once it's cleared, compare that with what's the cost of clearing 1 hectare of land, and makes that decision. So they only compare their private costs and their private benefits. What that means is that they're not taking account of the wider costs of society of the decisions that they make. And if clearing that 1 hectare of forest land has costs in terms of carbon emissions, it has costs in terms of biodiversity loss, then that will mean that in the absence of any intervention, ecosystem services will be underprovided. So there'll be more clearing of forest land, less provision of ecosystem services than would be socially optimal. And by socially optimal, I mean if we took account of all costs and all benefits, rather than just the cost of benefits accruing to the landowner. And so the idea of payments for ecosystem services is if you receive a payment that's equal to the value to society of the carbon from that forest land, the biodiversity conservation on that forest land, the watershed protection services provided by that forest land, if you receive a payment that's equal to those values, then as the landowner, when you're making a decision, do I clear 1 hectare of land, you're now comparing what are the benefits of clearing the land in terms of agricultural production, in terms of timber, with what are the costs of clearing that land in terms of the cost of conversion, but also I won't receive this payment if I clear the land. So because they're now taking account of effectively the social costs, then we should get the optimal amount of ecosystem service provision because all costs and all benefits are being accounted for. So this is how it works in theory. Obviously, actually, working out the payment level is difficult, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But that's the idea of why they might be used. And a little bit of information on how they're used. They're a new idea. They're a new type of policy mechanism. They weren't really around before the 1980s, but they were introduced in the US, in various European countries, mainly in the agricultural context. So the Conservation Reserve Program, which might be familiar to some of you, is an example of payment for ecosystem services. The idea is that farmers use land management practices that maintain clean water, that reduce soil erosion, that in general terms provide ecosystem services, or in fact more often provide landscape benefits and kind of habitat preservation, and so they receive compensation for doing that. There are similar schemes in Europe. So those were the first programs that were introduced. And then in the kind of late 1990s onwards, then there were some large programs that were introduced in developing countries. And they become more and more popular in developing countries because they're seen as a kind of win-win mechanism. So the idea is that not only do you get environmental improvements, but by providing payments to rural landowners who may be relatively poor in a developing country setting, then you're also providing income for these rural landowners. Now, there are issues about, well, how can it actually be win-win if we're just compensating them? But it's still seen as a good thing to use, at least in comparison to just regulations that say you must not deforest. If we're concerned about the welfare of poor farmers, then providing the payment is better than just regulating or taxing. So there was a large program in China called the Sloping Land Program that was focused on watershed protection. It had payments for reforesting agricultural land. There's been large programs in Costa Rica and in Mexico that are mainly focused on avoiding deforestation with some reforestation elements as well. And these programs were mainly focused on biodiversity conservation, but in particular watershed protection. So there was concern about forest loss leading to flooding and water quality issues and so on. So that was kind of the big area in which payments for ecosystem services were being used. In the last few years, now all of the attention, or most of the attention, has now gone into the application of the payments for ecosystem services idea to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So in this case, the ecosystem service is carbon sequestration or reducing carbon emissions. And the idea is that by paying people to not deforest, or in fact also by paying people in some cases to restore forests, then that contributes to mitigating climate change. So that's been the main kind of push in terms of actually implementing payments for ecosystem services. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit more about REDD and what it was. So exact estimates vary, but there's agreement that a significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions arise as a result of land cover change. And by land cover change, it can mean various things, but it mainly means deforestation. So because it's so significant, and also because addressing land cover change is seen as a relatively low-cost way of achieving reductions in carbon emissions, there's been a lot of attention given in the last few years into how can we actually incorporate reductions in deforestation into global mechanisms for mitigating climate change. So at the moment, you don't get carbon credits for, say, reducing deforestation, but large amounts of money, I think the latest figure I could find was $6 billion, have been pledged to actually go into developing mechanisms, developing methods for bringing reductions in deforestation into wider trading programs and mechanisms for reducing carbon emissions, mitigating climate change. So the reason why it's seen as important but it hasn't been done yet is because it's extremely difficult. There are huge challenges associated with actually implementing REDD. The idea is that avoidance of deforestation, because it reduces carbon emissions, ought to be a way of receiving carbon credits. So it ought to be a valid way of meeting carbon reduction, commitments. But actually proving that you have reduced carbon by reducing your deforestation is very difficult. So it's difficult because how do you know that deforestation would have taken place otherwise? That if there was not going to be any deforestation, you say, okay, well, if I didn't deforest, you didn't do anything. And so how can you prove that you would have deforested in the absence of the carbon payments or the carbon credits? There are also issues about if you don't deforest in one place, you might just deforest somewhere else. So how do you prove that there isn't this kind of spatial leakage? So these are huge challenges, and they're not things that people have figured out the answers to yet. But large amounts of time and large amounts of money are going into partly figuring out how do we address these issues. So how do we actually report and verify reductions in carbon emissions? Also going into strengthening institutions, because deforestation is mainly taking place in countries where actually implementing policies and monitoring those policies would be challenging. So strengthening national institutions is important, strengthening local institutions is important. And also in piloting projects to see, okay, well, what can be done in practice? So this is something that, yeah, isn't there yet in terms of policy, but is a big focus in how do we actually figure it out, which makes it a good time to be thinking, okay, what information do we need to actually put it into practice? Is it likely to be a good avenue to go down? So that's RED as a whole, and so hopefully I've kind of persuaded you that it is, at least in some circles, a big deal. It's also a big deal in Brazil. So this diagram shows, in green, countries that are receiving these kind of voluntary funds for trying to develop RED mechanisms. And in red shows the countries that are actually funding the development of these mechanisms. And you can see that it's pretty widespread, but Brazil is a significant target of existing attention that's being given to reducing emissions through deforestation and degradation. Okay, so it is important in Brazil, and there's a number of reasons why Brazil is seen as important or seen as a good option for trying out or implementing these policies. One is that there's a large carbon stock, and there's rapid deforestation. But also, unlike other countries where there's a large carbon stock and rapid deforestation, there are somewhat stronger institutions, and also Brazil has much superior technical ability to actually monitor land cover change. So they have a land cover change remote sensing system that actually provides real-time monitoring, classification of land cover images. So it's more likely to be able to actually implement these policies effectively. There are still some difficulties. There are many different reasons for deforestation in Brazil, many different types of people engaged in deforestation. There are issues with land rights in some areas. There's historically been an issue with enforcement of existing policies to reduce deforestation. But it's still one of the main targets of these kind of RED efforts. Okay, so that was quite a lot of background just to say, why are we doing all of this? There are serious problems with trying to actually implement RED, but there's a lot of interest in how can we actually overcome these challenges. And the final point I want to make about it is one of the reasons why there's so much interest in it is that it's assumed that it's a low-cost way of mitigating climate change. So the idea of global efforts towards reducing carbon emissions to mitigating climate change is that, in a sense, it doesn't matter where you get those carbon reductions from. Okay, so you could get it by changing the technology you use to power cars. You can get the carbon reductions from changing the technology you use for steel production. You can get it from switching from fossil fuels to alternative sources of energy. So there are various different ways you can achieve reductions in carbon emissions. But reducing land cover change or reducing deforestation is assumed to be a relatively low-cost way of doing this. So part of what I'm interested in is, okay, but how low cost? Is it actually as low cost as it's thought to be? And so what I'm focusing on is, how much would we actually have to pay if we were having a payment for ecosystem services scheme, which could look like, buying carbon credits. Then how much would we actually have to pay for those carbon reduction benefits? And there's two ways to think about that. One is, how much is the buyer of the ecosystem services? So remember, we have a buyer and a provider. How much is the buyer willing to pay? And the amount that the buyer is willing to pay should be based in principle on what is the value of the ecosystem services that they're buying. So often that's complicated. In this case, it's actually not as complicated because the ecosystem service is reduction in carbon emissions. And so, actually people have put a lot of work into kind of putting a price on carbon. But the other part of, what should the payment level be is, at most, it should be the value of the ecosystem services. There's no reason to pay more than the value of the ecosystem services. But at minimum, it needs to be whatever the provider will be willing to accept. So remember, this is a voluntary contract. The provider will only accept it if it's worthwhile for them. And what that means is the provider will only accept it if the amount that they are receiving is more than they could earn if they did deforest in this case. So it's based on what we call the opportunity cost, which is what you're foregoing if you use the land in its best alternative use. And that's what I'm interested in, is what is the opportunity cost of the land? What could the farmers earn if, rather than taking a payment to avoid deforestation, they did actually clear the land and use it, in this case, in agriculture? That's what I'm focusing on, with the idea that a landowner won't enter a program, they won't accept a contract, if the payment doesn't at least compensate them for their opportunity cost. There might be other issues. There might be differences in the riskiness. They might get some other benefit from the forest, which I'll talk about a bit. But basically, the payment needs to compensate them for their opportunity cost. And so what this means is that to implement payments for ecosystem service for carbon, so a red type mechanism, there are various pieces of information that we need. So we need to know, well, what's the value of the ecosystem service? We need to know, well, what is the likelihood that the land actually would be converted? These are the things that I'm not going to look at in this paper, but they're important questions. What I am going to focus on is, what are the opportunity costs of avoided deforestation? And what are the benefits that are foregone if you don't clear the land? And how do those benefits change over time? Okay, so I'm not the first person to think that this might be an important question. There have been some global estimates. So this 2007 study wasn't focused on carbon, it was focused on biodiversity conservation. But it basically looked at what were the returns to land and agriculture in different parts of the world, and used that as a basis for estimating what were the opportunity costs of protecting forests for biodiversity conservation. And they came up with a figure of $55 per hectare per year on average. Now, at the global level, then an average doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense, because they actually found a range from $0 to $6,500 per hectare per year. We're talking about wildly different land characteristics. So, that tells you, okay, something, but not a whole lot, maybe. Although you can look at how that is distributed across different locations. There have been a few studies that have looked specifically at the Brazilian Amazon. Again, there's going to be variation, inevitably, but it's a somewhat more homogeneous area. There was one study that used data at the municipality level, but used secondary data to say, on average, across the whole of the legal Amazon in Brazil, then returns to land and agriculture were about $75 per hectare per year. They may have considered timber harvesting as well, I'm not sure. And then another study actually modeled the decisions made by ranchers and came up with a figure of $12 to $80 per hectare per year. So this is the kind of area these values are in, which is relevant. Okay, so anybody who's looking at this, don't worry too much about these equations. I'm going to talk in fairly general terms. about what some of the issues with the existing measures are. So in theory, the opportunity cost, this value C, is equal to the sum of the returns that you could get from converting the land to agriculture each year into the future over whatever time horizon you're interested in. And then this term at the bottom is basically we discount some of the future value because it's being received in the future rather than in the present. Okay, so we don't just sum what are the benefits that you could get in each year into the future. We say that we care more about benefits now or soon than benefits a long way in the future. So we'll discount those future benefits. But basically, it should be the sum of the expected benefits. You don't know what the benefits are actually going to be in the future, which are the returns to land in agriculture minus the returns to land as standing forest. Okay, so as you get potentially some benefits from having standing forest, we want to know how much more would you get if you converted to agriculture. There are two issues with this. One is that existing estimates are actually based on not what are the expected future returns, but what are the current returns to land in agriculture. That might not be equal to the future returns. The other issue is that it assumes that the value of standing forest is 0. And this may be true, and this is one of the things that we want to look at. But alternatively, it may be that there are amenity values from forest. It may be that there are local ecosystem services from forest, non-timber forest products. If those are important, then those should, in theory, be subtracted from the returns to land and agriculture, because they would lower the opportunity cost and therefore lower the necessary payment to compensate for that opportunity cost. As I say, it also assumes that rather than what the expected future benefits might be, it just takes what are the current benefits, multiplies them by the number of years into the future, discounting for the fact that some of those benefits are in the future. So it assumes that basically all future benefits will be the same, and there are two important reasons why they might not be the same. So one is that future benefits might be lower if the quality of agricultural land is deteriorating over time, which is a particular concern about production in tropical forest regions. And then the other is that actually the returns could get higher over time with regional development. So if the returns to land and agriculture are the profits you can earn from actually selling what you produce, then prices may rise. Prices of inputs could fall if infrastructure improves so they can be brought into the region more cheaply. There's reasons why actually agriculture might get more profitable as the region develops. And so given that, then what this study aims to do is estimate, what are the opportunity costs, what are the values of land and alternative uses, doing two things. So one is we do estimate, what are the returns to land and agricultural production, but we estimate the returns to both forest land and agricultural land. We then compare that with the stated values of the land. So we have the returns in production in 1 year, but we also ask people what their property is worth. Now, in theory, we could use land prices. That would provide the same information, that land prices should be the sum of the discounted expected future benefits. The issue here is that we don't have land prices because land markets aren't very developed in this region and typically wouldn't be in other similar forest frontier regions. So in the absence of land prices, then we use stated values, just asking people what their land would be worth if they were to sell it. And what this does is that should incorporate what are their expectations about the future returns to their land. So the value to of the land now is not just what is it producing now, but it's also what do I expect it to produce in the future. And it also includes values of land that aren't to do with agricultural production. So for example, if there are amenity values to forest, then that will be incorporated in what is the value of the land to the landowner, and it wouldn't be incorporated in the return to agricultural production. So we compare these two, and then we also look at the change over time. Okay, so I feel like I'm going quickly. If anybody has questions, then and happy to answer them if there are points of clarification on the way through. Okay, so now I'm getting more and more into the economics of this. The way that we actually estimate what are the values of land in different uses is through what's called a hedonic price model. So what this model does is assumes that any property is can be characterized as a bundle of attributes. So any property is can be characterized as it has a certain size, it has a certain location, it has land in certain uses, it has water or it doesn't have water. It has these different attributes. And by comparing across lots and lots of different properties that have different combinations of attributes and have different values, then we can isolate what is the contribution of one particular attribute to the overall value. The idea is, for example, let's say different properties are different distances from the main road. Different properties are different distances from the main road. Controlling for all the other differences in these properties, then we would expect to see that the total value of the property, or the total price of the property, is higher for those who are closer to the main road than those who are further from the main road. It's better to be closer to the main road. By controlling for all the other differences in the properties, controlling for all the other characteristics, then we can actually estimate how much higher is the total value for a property that is 1 kilometer closer to the main road. By estimating that, we can say, what is the value that is placed on being 1 kilometer closer to the main road? That's what we're trying to do, is isolate or control for other characteristics to say how much does one particular attribute of the property contribute to its overall value. And that gives us a price for that actual attribute, even if that attribute is something that isn't bought or sold in the market. So this type of estimation, by the way, has lots of other applications to environmental non-market values, which could be of interest to some of you. But we're using it here to actually estimate what's the value of land in pasture, what's the value of land in forest. And so, yeah, this variation gives us what is the price of one unit of the attribute that we're interested in. Okay, so I'll go back to talking a little bit more generally now. The data that I'm using for the study comes from a region called Ouro Preto do Oeste, which is in the state of Rondônia, which is kind of on the Brazilian border with Bolivia. So this darker green area is the legal Amazon in Brazil. The medium green is the rest of Brazil, and the rest of that is South America. So there's kind of an active deforestation frontier that runs from the southwest to the northeast of the legal Amazon. So most of the area to the northwest there is still in forest, and most of the area to the southeast has been cleared. And that frontier is kind of moving towards the northwest. So this region is, we kind of refer to it as an old frontier. A lot of the land's been deforested already. It's kind of slightly behind the active frontier. And then we look at 6 municipalities, kind of in the middle of the state. It's an area that was colonized or settled through government colonization programs. So these programs, starting in the 1970s, but still continuing, the government land agency demarcated lots of land and allocated them to incoming migrant settlers. So people came from other parts of Brazil to settle in this Amazon region, which was previously, there were a few indigenous groups, but very few people. And they were given lots of land. The land was completely forested to begin with. Each property, this is the standard kind of layout, is 500 meters wide by 2 kilometers long. There's a road that runs along here. The houses are generally near the road, and then the properties are cleared from the road back to the back of the property. Yeah.
Why the parcels are so of such regular shape? I assume parcel will have various shapes, but it looks really.
Yeah, so in this case, because the government land agency went in before there were any people, they just went in and they drew on a map and they said, okay, this is property number 1, this is property number 2, and they just drew them on the map. So that's why, in general, they are this very regular rectangular shape. There were then some settlements where they were less regular shape, where some attention was paid to the kind of physical geography. And then there were some that, these ones are quite a lot smaller. So these are 100 hectares. These ones I think are about 37 hectares, something like that, where all the houses are in the middle and the properties then radiate out, which is meant to help kind of social networks. Those settlements haven't been hugely successful so far, so maybe it didn't help social networks. But maybe they were also on poorer land as well. So most of them are this shape, some of them are this shape, but basically the government land agency drew out the plots of land and allocated them to individual households. And then those households have gradually been clearing the land. In terms of what's happening in the region, then the main use of the land is actually for dairy cattle. So a lot of kind of what you hear about Brazil in the media, hear about the Amazon in the media, is beef cattle. Dairy cattle ranching is slightly more intensive and probably slightly more profitable. And so the farmers, they use some of the land for agriculture, some of the land for annual and perennial crops, but they use most of the land for cattle pasture. They produce milk. The milk is collected by local dairies, and that's the main source of income in the area. This is an example of some of the cleared land for pasture. And there are a few urban centers within the region that have been expanding over the last 20 years. So now some people are moving into these regions or into these urban centers. They're developing, related to this agricultural production, but, increasingly independently as well. And so the data that we've collected there is a household survey that follows the same households, in fact, from 1996 to 2009. But I'm only using the 2000, 2005, 2009 data. And then we link that to remote sensing data on the land cover on that particular property. So we can actually see the process of deforestation on that property and link that to what households say about their income and their wealth and their demographics. And we also have other spatial information on the land quality, on the infrastructure, and so on. So that's basically what we're using to analyze this. And just very briefly, this is the kind of process of deforestation. Even by 1996, the green is forest and the yellow is pasture. A lot of the land had been cleared. And since then, clearing is very far advanced. So I'm going to present results very soon on, first of all, what is the stated value of the property, as I mentioned, as a function of the land and different uses, which is what I'm interested in, and then other characteristics of the land that I'm controlling for. I'm also going to look at neighboring land use to see whether forest on neighboring land affects either the value or the agricultural revenue. And then in the model of annual revenue from agriculture, we also control for things that might affect returns to agriculture but shouldn't affect land value, like what inputs you actually use that year, and some of the characteristics of the farmer that might affect whether you're a good farmer or not, but wouldn't affect the value of the land if somebody else was to buy it. And what we're interested in is how 1 more hectare of each land use increases the total value of the lot or increases the total returns to agriculture. Okay, this is lots of numbers. You don't need to look at all of them. Basically, the top 2 are the dependent variables that we're looking at, and the value has gone up 2000 to 2005. It went down slightly in 2009, but that was mainly because some of the lots were split, so the average size of the lot went down a bit. I think the per hectare value continued to go up. And revenues from agriculture, these are in real terms, controlling for inflation, have also gone up. And very briefly, these are the variables that are actually included in the model, different land types, input, some of the characteristics of the property, and some of the characteristics of the household. So that's what we're actually including in the model. And I'm going to move through those results and just talk about the key results that we have got to so far. So what these results say is that in agriculture, then a hectare of land in forest doesn't contribute anything to agricultural production. And this is as we would expect. People aren't actually using the forest land, they're only using the pasture. Pasture is contributing an increasing amount, so the value of pasture, the contribution of pasture to the total value of the lot has been increasing, or it didn't increase 2000 to 2005, but it increased a lot from 2005 to 2009. And then when we use the model using stated value of land, so these are basically alternative measures of value. This is the one that previous studies have used. This is what we're using for comparison. Then the value of pasture has been increasing. The value of forest land has also been increasing. The fact that there's 0 in 2000, I need to look into a little bit more. I think it's because in 2000, land simply wasn't scarce. So there are other characteristics of the land, like its location and its soil quality, that contribute to the value of the property, but the exact, how many hectares do you have wasn't so important. The other feature is that the value of forest is higher than the value of pasture, and I'll talk about why that might be. So first of all, the returns to agriculture were broadly similar to other studies. So kind of a bit over $100, higher in 2009. We know that this area is a relatively productive area, so the fact that it's a little higher than the other measures from the Brazilian Amazon is reasonable. The next finding was that the value of pasture has been increasing over time, and what that suggests is that the returns to agriculture are increasing. So that may be to do with regional development, like I was talking about earlier, better infrastructure, higher demand, but it may also be to do with new technology. So as I said, most of the production is milk production, and there's been increasing use, for example, of refrigeration so that farmers can actually sell cold milk rather than lukewarm milk. And you can get a higher price for cold milk because I guess it can be sold as milk, whereas milk that hasn't been refrigerated needs to be processed into yogurt or cheese or whatever. So it might also be new technology contributing to increasing returns to agriculture. The other feature was that the value of forest was higher than the value of pasture. And this could suggest two things, and I don't necessarily know for sure which thing it is. So it could be that forest has other values that aren't captured in agricultural production, but are captured in land values. Or it could be that pasture is deteriorating. My suspicion is that it's the latter, because we didn't find any impact of neighboring forest. So if there were kind of, say, local externalities from forest, then more local ecosystem services provided by forest, we would expect neighboring forest to have an impact on values, even if you weren't going to convert it. The reason I think it's actually more likely to be deterioration of pasture is that those impacts didn't appear. So then the difference is that for the value of forest, remember it was 0 for agricultural production, value of standing forest is primarily that you could convert it. And so if the value of uncleared land is higher than the value of cleared land, that may suggest that cleared land is reducing in value. So the fact that you haven't cleared it yet means that when you do clear it, it will be more productive. So that is, like I say, I can't necessarily distinguish between these two things, but that's what it's looking like at the moment. Yeah.
You know how the land use changes over time, right? And you have these stated values over time. So couldn't you assume that land use changes are exogenous over time and then estimate your effect there?
So we do know how they change over time, but remember, we also have this regional development factor. So prices are actually rising over time. So returns to land are rising over time. So that suggests that this is outweighing the deterioration, because we're actually seeing the value of pasture rise over time. And we're seeing the value of forest rise over time.
But so you can look at relative values, right?
Okay, I'm going to think through that, because like I say, I'm still working on exactly how do we separate these things. What's your name? Can I talk to you about exactly what you have in mind? But yeah, I think there is something there, but I need to kind of work through it. Basically, we have these two effects. So at the moment, we haven't kind of isolated them. Okay, so far what this leads us to conclude is that the opportunity costs are actually rising over time. So part of this is that there's less and less uncleared land, there's less and less forest land, which will tend to raise the cost of avoided deforestation. If uncleared land is more valuable than cleared land, then as that gets more scarce, that gets more valuable. So avoiding deforestation on that uncleared land gets more expensive. If we were thinking about reforestation, then the opportunity cost of reforestation, which is allowing regeneration on pasture, should go down as if pasture is deteriorating. But if markets are developing, technology is developing, then that raises the opportunity cost of both avoided deforestation and reforestation, because that raises the value of both uncleared land and cleared land. So first of all, what that suggests is that if we're basing the cost of implementing REDD on current agricultural returns, then it's likely to be an underestimate. It also means that this, as I mentioned before, is an old frontier. This is somewhere deforestation has largely occurred. We can't necessarily avoid deforestation at this stage. But these types of patterns may well happen on other frontiers. So if you start saying, okay, look, land is very cheap because there hasn't been any development yet, we're going to put in contracts for 30 years or 50 years, then either people will have the incentive to try and renege on those contracts. If they're shorter contracts, they won't renew those contracts, because it may well be that the opportunity cost will actually rise with forest clearing and with development. Okay, and the final thing I want to say is that that's one piece of work. As I said, it's part of a broader project. And this broader project is now going forward. We've got a couple of proposals in right now to do more work in this area and in the wider region to bring in what are some of the hydrological changes and some of the geomorphological changes relating to land use change, and how do people respond to those. The idea is basically that we want to understand how does the process of deforestation affect local rivers and streams, water quantity and water quality. How do people then working on that land respond to those changes? How do they adapt to those changes? And how do their adaptations then feed back to processes of land cover change? So because people will be making different decisions, because they're faced with different water inputs, then those decisions may well affect the rate at which they deforest, the ways in which they use their land, and so that would either exacerbate or mitigate the ecosystem level effects. So that's where I'm going. I'm afraid I've taken us almost to the end, but if there are any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. Okay, I'll go for you if you didn't ask one yet.
So I think both of our campuses here, yours and ours, has this goal, climate action plan. So, I mean, if you take our 10 petagrams of carbon per year of human emissions, I mean, what are we looking at for this cost for the planet to be carbon neutral? Have you done that math?
So I haven't done it for the planet because as you know, these values only apply to marginal changes. So if you start trying to apply it to, let's just not cut down any more forests ever, the values would change considerably. So I wouldn't even try to do it for the planet. I have done it kind of back of the envelope. I think it might be here for the this actual land to compare what are carbon prices. So these are, like I say, I've only scribbled these down. I need to go and check into all of the figures, but basically what it suggested was that in this region, reducing a hectare of deforestation would be worth $3,000. We could think about how we wanted to actually translate that into a payment, but a payment of, say, $200 per hectare per year over 15 years, but without any certainty that the forest wouldn't be chopped down after that. Basically, what this is suggesting is that the opportunity costs are pretty high relative to the carbon benefits. Well,
Yeah, I was just wondering what you think the likelihood of programs like RED are in succeeding given rising land prices and the fact that the developing economies or developed economies contributing the money are all kind of in crisis, and then there's programs like in Ecuador where they said give us money so we don't develop oil in our beautiful national
Yeah.
park, and they raised practically no money compared to what they were asking, and it seems like there's just not the
yeah, so that was what I was kind of saying. There are such big obstacles. And so part of them are this, are you actually providing anything by not deforesting? I think that was a big part of the issue in the Ecuador case, is at the moment, people who could potentially be buyers of red credits aren't believing that reduction, like actual carbon emission reductions, are being achieved. So finding some way to do that, I don't think it's completely impossible. Using baseline rates of deforestation and that kind of thing, it's not inconceivable, but it is a problem to people actually being willing to pay money. And so I think that's what happened in the Ecuador case. I think this rising land prices thing is something that hasn't been considered to the same extent, which is why I think this work kind of fits into that and says that that may be another constraint. So I think the kind of, are we actually getting any additionality issue is recognized as being a huge one, and it is a huge one, and it's probably the biggest one. But I think this, actually, it might not be as cheap as it appears to be issue. It's another complication. So, I think trying to figure it out is important, because I think the potential is something really valuable, but I think it's a long way off. Did you have a similar question?
Any idea what the dollar per ton of CO2 is going to be on this?
I haven't done the calculation for these results.
Okay.
So yeah, I could work it through and calculate it. I haven't done it yet.
All right.
But yeah, or you had one.
So this is a little bit more about the econometrics, and it seems like the regional development model is really important to determining that scarcity value of additional land.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I'm particularly interested in the fact that this is a dairying area, and dairying has a pretty common trajectory towards intensification and more technology that potentially could work against that future scarcity value if you bring the cost of production down, right? And land isn't necessarily the biggest one. So I wonder about how well, if you could potentially bring down your red payment estimate. This is just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
And what your confidence is in the ability for the model to incorporate the changes, some predictable or some scenarios around changes in the agricultural economic system over 50 years, because you're really capturing this this weird.
So yeah, because I'm still extrapolating
reality, right?
from 5-10 years to 50
Yeah.
years, which is maybe a slight improvement from 1 year to 50 years. But yeah, I take your point. It isn't taking us the whole way there, and I think it. Yeah, so I think it doesn't capture all that complexity. I think the intensification question is one that people have studied in other contexts, and there isn't clear answer on, does intensification increase or reduce land cover change? Because it raises profits, which raises the returns to land, but it reduces the amount of land that's needed, and it goes both ways, I think. So other types, I don't know about intensification of dairy, but other types of intensification in these kind of forest areas, I think on balance still increase the incentives